Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we're talking about the unique, most American tradition ever, the suburb. That's right, we're talking about suburbs and why they are no longer sustainable. In other words, sorry, America, your rural lifestyle is just simply no longer sustainable. We're going to go over why the rural lifestyle is no longer sustainable, why suburbs don't work anymore, why they never really did work, their racist past, and why we should reject the suburb in favor of closer, denser, more intimate housing. This is the Cameron Journal podcast. Let's dive in. This is the Cameron Journal podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal podcast.
5 years ago, this was a vast checkerboard of potato farms on New York's Long Island. Today, a community of 60,000 persons living in 15,000 homes, all built by one firm. This is Levittown, one of the most remarkable housing developments ever conceived.
I used to review indie books. There was a fascinating philosopher who lived in Hong Kong, and he loved cities, and wrote about them as these biomechanical machines that were living things. His books were thick, but fascinating. For him, the city had energy, charm, and so much more. So why don't we think about cities that way in America? Cities are wonderful, dynamic places. They're vibrant and there's plenty to do. There's less long driving, things are closer, and there's far more people, and often, despite the stereotype, a real sense of community. Cities are often diverse places where a variety of cultures all melt together, usually in harmony. Cities often boast mass transit and walkability that is unknown out in the suburbs. Before the suburb, most people lived in cities or towns where mass transit was common, as most people did not own cars, and walkability was a major priority. People lived in neighborhoods that they could afford, and most cities had a variety of businesses and houses all commingled together into one patchwork of humanity. So why did we start building the suburbs to start with?
So here's the home that cost its happy owners just $9,000. And that includes such extras as a completely equipped kitchen, a two-way fireplace, a finished room in the attic, and even a washing machine.
After World War II, America had a terrible housing crisis. The whole world did, really. Europe had been destroyed by the war, and in America, millions of GIs were coming home and ready to go to school, take jobs, and start families. Housing all of these men and their new families would be a massive challenge. City planners got to work designing new, dense housing blocks. After all, since the Industrial Revolution, people had been living in cities in huge numbers. City planners figured that that trend would continue, and that people would need new housing within massive apartment buildings within cities. However, a few trends made those massive housing blocks unnecessary and eventually blighted. One of those trends was the popularity of the automobile, and the other was cheap home loans. Both of those things allowed people to leave cities behind in droves as they looked to buy their own single-family homes in the suburbs. The economic picture was changing as well, and I'll come to that later. Government-backed home loans helped developers like William Levitt start to build suburbs. His mass-production housing construction methods allowed him to build modest homes quickly and cheaply, making them affordable for the average person. The suburb was born. The stores weren't mixed in with the housing like in cities. Shopping centers and malls on the edge of the housing popped up. How do you get to them? By car, of course, the new car that you just bought at the friendly dealer. Americans bought millions of cars after the war. Seeking cheap land, developers bought up land around cities and built ever more developments. Zoning laws separated housing from business as an industry. Racial policies excluded most minorities who could not get loans, and this triggered one of the great crises of the American city: white flight. As white people moved the jobs and wealth to the suburbs, cities were left in crisis with few residents and few local businesses able to hang on through what population was left. Cities became a place to commute to, rather than a place to live. This was the suburban model: a housing area, a shopping area, and a work area. Eventually, this trend changed, and cities have been revitalized in a way that was unimaginable just 30 or 40 years ago. So what happened? A variety of things. One of them is human, and the other is economic. Suburbs are a uniquely American phenomenon. One of the first things you notice when you leave the United States is how much smaller and dense the rest of the world is. In most of the places, you see towering housing blocks, not sprawling suburbs. Part of that is due to age. Most European and often some Asian cities were built in a time when cities had to be walkable. It was the primary way to get around, or were built that way to move people quickly and easily. It's also a matter of land. The United States is a massive country compared to most other countries. China, Russia, Canada, and Australia are comparable in size. When traveling abroad, it's fun to play the game of distances with people. With the exception of New England, most Americans can't get out of their state within 2 hours of straight driving. In Europe, it can be a different story. Provinces and national borders are easily crossed within hours of driving. Meanwhile, in America, drivers must slog through mile after mile of tedious fields, mountains, valleys, and empty desert. For most of the country, the nearest other foreign country is hundreds of miles away. This excess amount of space has allowed our cities to balloon in size. Rather than building dense communities and close villages around city centers, suburbs and master planned communities sprawl over the land around city centers, connected by road networks to big cities where people commute daily in SUVs. The average American commute is up to 25.4 minutes. However, this varies by region. In the traffic choked coasts, commute times soar quickly. Commutes of 90 minutes or more are becoming commonplace for people living in and around urban centers. This massive sprawl is terrible. One of the early leaders in new urbanism was Jane Jacobs. She was a freelance writer and became a huge urbanization advocate. She saw suburbs for what they are, sprawling places where the human scale of things goes to die. She saw how community would be destroyed and how cities would be destroyed. She saw how people need that sense of community, and she saw how a focus on things rather than people would eventually destroy cities. Her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, is essential reading. Suburban sprawl encourages car commuting, which has its own environmental impacts, and there is the matter of how much land is used for the sake of roads and bridges and infrastructure required for those things. The sprawl of shopping centers, malls, and housing is also a problem. Much of this land used to be farms or simply left natural as wetlands or other ecology for the natural world. Slowly, we have encroached on those natural systems. The sprawling lawns are no place for many insects, especially pollinators, to live. Nature has to find new places when these developments are built. That doesn't even account for the use of water for lawns or pesticides used to keep those lawns green and uniform. These houses have an outsized impact on the environment and on humans. By living far apart, we lack the close-knit communities of sitting on stoops or just meeting people in the street. The suburb is not actually a new phenomena. It actually comes from the Latin. The suburbs in Rome were the neighborhoods around cities where poor people lived. At one point, I believe in the 2nd century, they actually built a wall around the Roman Forum so that the wealthy who lived in the urban center would not be forced to look at the poor in the suburbs. This whole idea of having sprawling housing around cities is not new. Rome was the first city to ever reach 1 million people. It's one of the few in the ancient world that ever had that distinction due to all those pipes and latrines and aqueducts the Romans were so good at building. However, the American suburb is different because the wealthy moved to the suburb, not the poor. In the ancient world, the poor usually lived out of the city center, and the urban population was far wealthier. And although the wealthy might have a country house, that would be farther out. Poor people obviously needed inexpensive housing near where they worked, for whatever job one might have had in the ancient world, being a blacksmith or something along those lines. So the modern American suburb really is different. I grew up in the suburbs of Denver. I learned to appreciate some of the conveniences of suburban life. The lack of parking meters and paid parking spots was convenient. The ability to travel down wide neighborhood streets without navigating the automobile stifled narrow city roads of Denver had its appeal. My neighborhood was built in the late 1960s. Modest houses of one story with a basement, three small bedrooms, and a kitchen with a sizable garage. Up my street and around the corner, some split level ranches popped up. The development had been conveniently created between two major roads in an expanding area around the west of Denver. I grew up in a little town called Arvada, and it's conveniently located between two big cities, Denver and Boulder, so the area was ideal for commuting. In other words, this suburb had everything going for it. It even had a mall nearby with a large parking lot that only ever filled at Christmas time. It was a nice way to live and a nice way to grow up, but the environment was stifling. There were no people walking around our large blocks. The nearest grocery store was a 10 to 20-minute drive. I get the convenient aspect of suburban living, but the drawbacks are almost immediate. Suburbs excel at killing the human scale of things. That's the drawback. Suburbs aren't really built for people. They're built for cars, houses, and the things that go inside those houses. Walking through suburbs with their winding streets and long blocks is an exhausting adventure. You can walk for the several minutes and pass the same three houses and not see a single shop, bench, or anything that isn't privately owned. They have done a good job of housing people, but even suburbs have lost their use for that as the price of houses has gone up so high in most major metro areas that many people simply can't afford the same house that their parents bought at their same age. If housing were smaller, denser, and more human, this would alleviate many of these problems. However, many people who have the privilege of living in these neighborhoods don't want the quote unquote character of the neighborhood to change and don't want to see apartment blocks and townhouses rise up near their postage stamp yards in massive beige boxes. Suburbs used to be a haven for wealth and a wall against poverty, but even that isn't true anymore. As cities have become more expensive, poorer people move out to the cheaper suburbs. Instead of owning, they often rent, and if they do own, the struggle of home ownership can be financially crushing. Is it a wonder that Americans are demanding inexpensive housing that's near transit and near where they go to work? Suburban sprawl is dangerous. We can't sustain this level of sprawl. It's becoming difficult to keep up the roads that continue to take a pounding year after year while nothing is properly repaired. I'm reminded of this daily here in Seattle. Driving around Seattle, it can seem like you're driving in a third world country where the dictator spends more money on weapons and the military than essential services for the citizenry. In the now infamous omnibus spending package, military spending in this last fiscal year was increased by approximately $56 billion. Dollars. Imagine what $56 billion in increased military spending could do for our infrastructure. In any case, while President Trump buys more military hardware, the rest of us have to navigate the tire killing potholes or carefully drive over roads that are losing their improved status. The situation is so dire that some municipalities have taken to grinding down roads to dirt to save on maintenance cost. Rather than try to keep up with regular road maintenance, cities like Omaha, Nebraska are choosing to simply do away with pavement and give people an improved dirt road instead. The costs are far cheaper, and it's easier to repair and fix. But the reality is that if cities hadn't sprawled outward, we wouldn't have these problems to begin with. There's something more important than the travesty that is dirt roads in the middle of Omaha. It's the fact that America has too many miles of roads. The United States is a massive country, and we spent the first half of the 20th century building roads to accommodate cars. Making it easy for cars to get to any point in these United States was a top priority well into the 1970s. This led to the construction of thousands of miles of roads. These roads enabled Americans to flee cities and move out to freshly built suburbs and exurbs. In the middle of the 20th century, we built ever wider highways and bulldozed neighborhoods to make getting around at 55 miles an hour as easy as possible. Rather than exist in cramped cities where mass transit and walking were the common forms of transportation, Americans moved out to small towns, suburbs, and exurbs where lone houses rambled on land that was near a city or other job center. The US was unique in that vast tracts of the country were still uninhabited by mid century, and cities had vast areas to expand into, with new single family housing developments and plenty of roads for all the cars that people would be driving to get to and from work. Roads no longer became spaces for humans, they became spaces for cars. City planners have failed to build neighborhoods that people can actually use. This means that neighborhoods need to accommodate transit, cars, bicycles, pedestrians, and a variety of shops and services, rather than putting all of this at the edges of massive developments. This discussion of sprawl comes up often when funding mass transportation projects. When it comes time to build mass transit, one of the biggest problems with American cities is that they occupy so much land. Bus transit times between locations rise, which means more buses have to be put on routes, and planning train stops can be difficult too. The more space to cover, the more money it takes to build bus stop stations and create transportation for seniors and others who need more personalized transit. This all costs money. The suburbs are costing us billions in just transit alone. Pile on the amount of gas spent and the amount of money heating these large and efficient homes, and this amounts to a financial and environmental boondoggle that is strangling everyone. It's time for a new solution. However, this gets even worse once you leave America's cities. Now that we're out of the city, we're going to talk about the townies. For some Americans, living in a small or medium sized town was the balance between the urban and the suburban. A friend told me once his ideal city was maybe a small town of 10,000 people. But the reality is, that is how our country was built. And it just doesn't work. It doesn't work because you need to pool technology, talent, and cooperation into certain nodes. Cities are those nodes that allow fresh things, risks, and mistakes to occur. But that's not all. Small and medium sized towns, depending on how they're built, often aren't any more walkable than their suburban counterparts. This often means that Americans are living in houses in and around the town and use their car to get around. Getting around without a car is almost impossible. Bus service tends to stick to towns and cities where it's practical. Mass transit between towns and cities is notoriously weak. Americans have never taken to regional rail in the same way that Europe has outside the densely packed Northeast. The simple fact of the matter is this: our rural lifestyle is just not sustainable. To power this sort of lifestyle requires cars, roads, and lots of infrastructure. And the reality is that given the increasing costs of energy and the increasing costs of roadways, it is far better for people to live close to where they work and where they live. Before the car, most people had to live close. Transportation was by animal and rail in the 19th century. Most people walked everywhere. The middle class and wealthy may have used a carriage, but most people just walked. Cities had the advantage for being highly walkable and easy to navigate. However, with the advent of the car, all that changed. Even now, with urbanization coming back into style, most Americans still don't live in cities. Most Americans live in small and medium sized towns. Many of those towns are shrinking and going away as people move to cities for job opportunities. Many of these towns are eroding as many of the companies that supported them have moved factories overseas or to other parts of the country. This has left small towns bewildered with schools, roads, and other services that they can't afford to keep in good condition. It's even tougher for counties because counties are often responsible for the networks of roads in the unincorporated areas. Now, those roads don't just include dirt roads around farms, it includes paved roads and developments built outside of cities and towns to provide big houses and large yards to people who could commute into the town or city for employment. In some cases, the city ends up subsidizing those improvements, and county budgets are stretched to keep up with the infrastructure paid for by developers. The only way to solve this problem is for Americans to urbanize. Infilling is a tremendous movement. Our economic structure simply is not sustainable. The amount of gas spent commuting long distances only adds to fossil fuel dependency. Electric cars are a temporary band aid on that problem. They are far from a complete solution. The only solution is density. With density, commutes for everything will be shorter, less fuel will be used, mass transit becomes sustainable, and a real sense of community can flourish in the streets and areas within neighborhoods. There's also some pretty damning psychological effects to living in the suburbs as well. These are just some of the testimonials from people about the suburbs. This is taken from Leah Gallagher's TED Talk on her book about suburbs and the new urbanism called The Death of the American Suburb.
I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people about what they thought about their suburban experience today. I thought I would start by just sharing a little bit of what they said. I slowly realized it was not the life I wanted to lead. That was from a mother of four outside of Boston. We're only here until the kids are done with school. That was from a parent in Philadelphia. Congrats on the book. I live in a sterile, superficial suburb after having lived in Chelsea for 12 years, and I'm dying slowly, one day at a time. Talk soon, Rob.
Living far apart in suburbs is psychologically damaging. There's multiple factors to that. These include the aesthetic. How many suburbs are just the same version of the same 3 to 5 houses over and over and over again? Suburbs tend to have all their businesses and shopping on the edges near major roads and highways. This means that vast tracts of land are just house after house after house. How do you create community where there are a few third spaces, those that aren't home or work? And how do you enjoy it in close proximity when an entire area is simply houses? We are more isolated than ever before. Why is that? We lack spaces to socialize with other people. Malls were once great third spaces, but even now they're disappearing in some places. Americans have suffered from being alone in their homes and depending on their immediate family for emotional support. This is even more true when a crisis hits a family. A family is in crisis when they need the community most, but the built world of the suburbs doesn't encourage that kind of help and makes it time consuming to create community or take advantage of that community. This has a profound psychological effect on the people who live there. There's a reason transient and houseless people gather in downtown areas. It's simple. Services are available, and they're usually dense, walkable, and have transit options. The same should hold true for the rest of us. It's easier, cheaper, and faster to deliver services to people in a dense area. The fewer miles driven and the less time spent in cars, the more time you can spend actually caring for people, delivering food, or even moving commercial goods or providing a delivery service. A city can support multiple people with multiple lifestyles and needs. The suburbs and rural areas support very few lifestyles and very few needs because of the lack of services. Then there's the environmental costs. This pseudo-rural lifestyle, for those whose work doesn't take them in that direction, is very hard in the environment. There's obvious things like the increase in gasoline that must be burnt in order to transport people around, but there's also the less obvious knock-on effects as well. Suburbs usually get built over farmland. Only 18% of the entire planet is arable, which is a fancy word for farmland available. We're losing farmland and valuable ecosystems like wetlands and open spaces that often serve no other purpose than to exist. Rivers and streams get built up and around instead of being able to flow in natural patterns and move as they wish. When it comes to transportation and the environment, we need to get the most for what we have. We have to radically rethink our land usage and how we use the land best. And let's face it, building boring, uninspiring, vast neighborhoods of houses isn't it. The way suburbs are built can also be bad for the environment. Roads must be drained and that water has to go somewhere. Most single-family houses have lawns, which are an environmental disaster both for water usage and for pollinators and other insects. Grass doesn't need pollination, and neatly dense kept lawns don't provide any habitat for these creatures. These insects need unspoiled nature. They need the diversity of fields and even weeds for their own survival. Suburbs take all of that away, and it's slowly but surely killing our natural ecology. The jobs and opportunity from the suburbs are moving too. A major selling point on the suburbs is the economic potential. One part of this was the fact that the jobs were leaving the cities in the years after World War II, and the other one was the chance of owning a hard asset. Property, a home. People could pay off their mortgage and own their home, which they could sell at a modest profit. This trend was intact until 2008 when, for the first time ever, housing actually decreased in value. Economically, the suburbs made sense at one time. Companies needed massive amounts of cheap land that was not available in cities, and so those companies moved their jobs outside of cities and, thanks to helpful tax incentives, built factories that encouraged people to live in small towns, modest cities, or the suburbs of major cities. However, times have changed. The American economy is changing, and the economic future is no longer in those small towns and suburbs. Cities have become the primary job creators in a modern information-based economy, leaving the average commute at 44 minutes for most Americans. In 2020, the employment opportunities don't work anymore. The internet has allowed us to work anywhere, and so we desire a closeness that can't be replicated on camera. Although remote work has become more popular, and recent reports state that those who work remotely are happier than their commuting colleagues, it will take a major change in how American companies work for this to be widely adopted and allowing employees to live farther away from their place of employment. Right now, that is not the case. Right now, companies are moving to cities to take advantage of talent and opportunities, leaving Americans who live far from cities out of the economic engines of the 21st century. City centers have become the major driving forces of economic progress in this country, contrary to what everyone thought just a few years ago. And that means that for those who can get close enough to the city to take advantage of that, they will be able to build wealth and have a good life. For those who are left outside, their future will continue to be progressively bleaker. Is the suburb over? Probably not anytime soon. This is Leah Gallagher again, talking about the future of the suburb and the new urbanism that's happening right in the suburbs that we've grown to love and to hate.
How did we get here? This is supposed to be the American dream, aspired to the world over. Answering that question led me to write this book, The End of the Suburbs. Before you start throwing tomatoes at me, let me just say, this is the house I grew up in. I am a proud product of suburbia. And let me just also say that a lot of the changes that this idea brings are not so bad, even if you live in a suburb today. One of the biggest changes that's happening is this vast movement to urbanize our suburbs and to make them better places to live, and actually to create an almost third way so that we'll have not just city and suburb, but city and suburb and something in between.
Developers are still building them, and people are still buying houses in the new developments. However, there are some urbanization trends that are hitting cities too. Many large cities are seeing the small houses built after the war torn down in favor of what people call McModern. McModern is a very modern-looking box with 2 to 4 units occupying the lot where 2 single-family houses once stood. This development style is popular in the inner ring of suburbs around cities. Some cities like Seattle and Denver are upzoning to allow denser structures to be built in neighborhoods that were formerly single-family housing only. However, the tide against the suburb is beginning to turn. Walkability, transit, and less car usage are becoming watchwords for city planning. If this can be matched with denser housing that's affordable for everyone, then people will quickly move back into the city for the job opportunities alone. This trend will continue to accelerate for the time being. It may change at some point, and we may start to move back out into the great open space between our cities that requires some revolution in transportation and technology. It also requires cultural changes. We need to rethink housing and what housing looks and feels like. We need to rethink how to get around and how that might work. But one thing is very clear. Our suburban model isn't sustainable, it's inhumane, and it's time to move on.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.